glad you're here. Welcome to the second webinar in our Pathways to Personalization series. Hopefully you have the link, because I'm going to actually move forward. Roshni, you want to put it in the chat window in case anyone misses it? So today I have a larger than life Shawn Rubin next to me because he's the master of double booking himself. And it actually wasn't even his fault because he's at an end of year school meeting and they canceled and rebooked, so he had no choice. So he is here in spirit, and along with me today is my co-host Roshni Lakhi. You want to introduce yourself, Rosh?
Sure. My name is Roshni Lakhi. I am a program manager at the Highlander Institute and former math teacher for middle school in Providence, Rhode Island. So I love talking to teachers and hearing that point of view. So please let us know if you have any questions over the course of the next hour and a half.
So what we have planned today is similar to what we did last time. We are going to start by sharing some of our thinking around the pilot phase of the framework. And then we're going to have you divide up into smaller groups so you can really dive in and share your experiences and contemplate what does and doesn't resonate with you. So we are going to plan to talk for about 45, 50 minutes and then give you a nice chunk of time and then have you come back and share key points from your discussion. So just a little refresher. This is the Pathways to Personalization framework that we're working from, which is essentially an approach to change that starts with a design team and crafting a vision, and then moves through a really robust pilot phase, and then talks about how kind of to scale and replicate the work to other classrooms beyond those pilot classrooms. That's essentially the meat of our approach. And I wanted to refresh your memory about how this approach might be different from traditional change management approaches. So we're really trying to change the narrative about how school reform works and how it sticks and how change is really sustainable. And we feel like rather than top-down decisions, decision-making should be kind of combining the bottom-up approach with the top-down support. We are really about multiple routes to a destination and feel like single solutions have never really hit the mark. We want to make implementation decisions based on people who are ready and enthusiastic for the change, rather than having everyone implement simultaneously whether they're ready or not. And we kind of try to shy away from specific mandates to giving teachers really relevant choice and autonomy and agency in how they're working with new practices. And then finally, we try to be cognizant of the really crazy timeframes that we usually associate with change and whether things are working or not, and try to really see things through and continue to test and iterate as we go forward. So really the kind of crux of our model is building research and development engines in every school. So where a subset of teachers are really always thinking about what's next, thinking about how to codify and operationalize vision and how to move those practices through to colleagues so their colleagues feel comfortable with the adequate guidance and support to start implementing. And then when they hit challenges or barriers or new decisions have to be made, those pilot teachers continue to work in that same vein, testing new approaches, making recommendations, and it kind of continues on. Do you want to add anything, Roshni?
No, I think that sounds perfect so far.
Perfect. So today we are going back to our map, reviewing. So last time we talked about what our starting points were and where we were now, and we talked about a self-study and really looking at data and shadowing students and coming up with a vision of where we wanted to go. And now today we're talking about how we actually get there. And it's not going to be a direct route, just spoiler alert. It's going to be a lot of traveling in cars on the ground and a lot of exploring and doubling back and moving forward at different paces. So it looks a little bit messier than some single solution implementations. But what we do when we think about how will we get there, my slides are going, there we go. The first step is setting up really intentional pilots. And that starts by being very careful about selecting pilot teachers for this work.
All right, just before we jump ahead, I just wanted to make sure that everyone just knew two things that first, the webinar is being recorded. So in case you miss any part, if you fall off for any reason, this whole thing is being recorded. So you will get the slides and the entire recording after this in a couple days. And if you have any questions over the course of the next hour and a half, please feel free to use a chat window and just make sure you chat with everyone instead of just one person personally, so we can all see the questions on there. Some questions might be iterated with other people as well. So just type in the chat window to everyone. Kathy and I will be monitoring that, and we'll stop it periodically to ask questions and answer them. So please feel free to use that as well, and we're happy to answer those questions. So one big part that we're moving into now as we look at the pilot and refine phase is really thinking about how do we identify and support the right pilot teachers? Who are they? How do we find them? And how can we actually support them? So thinking back, if you were part of the previous webinar that we did last month, we talked a lot about who will lead this work. And specifically, we call it a design team. And the design team is led by someone we call a lead change agent, who really is a passionate, energetic, enthusiastic person who can really drive change and be the person behind this work. Typically someone who's on an executive team or administrative team, someone who sees the vision for change and can really empower the rest of the district and people on the design team to be part of this work. The design team can be made up between 6 to 14 members, and it's actually made up of key stakeholders from across the district. And this not only includes educators and administrators, but also who are often overlooked are students, parents, and community members. These are really important because they have an equal, if not more important voice at this table, especially students. If we are not including our end users in our actual design process, we are not solving for our end users. These are our end consumers, so we need to have students and parents at that table. And sometimes it's a little bit difficult because they may not share the same knowledge that educators have. They may have a completely different perspective. They may not say the things that you want to hear as an educator, but having their voice at the table is crucial to make sure we are actually encompassing all the right voices that are going to lead this design change process. And finally, who we'll talk a lot about today is a pilot teacher cohort. And these are the ones who are actually the teachers in the classrooms who are driving this change, and arguably one of the most important parts of this entire work, because these are the ones who are actually going to be in the trenches every single day, trying out different strategies and models in their classroom, and then documenting it so it's easy to share on and pass with everybody else. Because if they are the ones actually being that R&D engine that Kathy described, they are the ones who are going to document and lead the change for the rest of the educators in that building to actually have this scale further just beyond their own classrooms. So you have people that may have seen this. The Rogers Innovation Adoption Curve is a really popular curve that's been used actually across industries, but specifically it's really popular around the adoption of technology. And what's interesting about it is it talks about how people either have an aversion or affinity for innovation and risk. And so if you think about any release of a new product or technology, you can basically categorize everyone who is looking at that technology into one of these 5 different buckets. And these percentages are approximately where people are going to fall. So if you think about this entire adoption curve in, say, the example of an Apple iPhone release. Your Apple iPhone release, if you think about people who are going to buy this phone, you have your innovators who are the ones who are going to be the ones who are camping out literally the night before outside the Apple store for maybe 13, 14 hours to be literally those first ones who get their hands on that iPhone. And those are the ones who are going to write the first blogs about it and talk about it, but they're the ones who are literally the innovators who are most excited about this new product. The early adopters are going to be the ones who also get their hands on the phone relatively early on, but may not be the ones who are camping out overnight. They might be the ones who are actually going to the Apple store the next day, kind of reading a couple reviews about it, but are still really keen to get their hands on one of those iPhones very early on. When you think about the early majority, these might be the ones who are going to be thinking more about the reviews and waiting for them to come out. They may be thinking a little longer. Is their iPhone 6 really, is it still pretty good? Do I really need the iPhone 10? Can I wait a little bit longer? Is this just another product that's going to be obsolete again in another year? So do I need to really change that? And can I wait without it? So they're going to be a little bit more hesitant and take a little bit longer to actually go after that brand new iPhone coming out. The late majority, which is a pretty vast part of this group, are going to be thinking about what do I need to do to really change? So for example, as with the last iPhone release came out, there was the missing headphone jack, and that headphone jack was gone. And that requires you to not only buy a new phone, but also adapt this whole idea of Bluetooth. And these people who are in the late majority were not willing to make that big mind shift, which is actually moving from a actual headphone jack being plugged in to now buying Bluetooth headphones and buying those AirPods and actually having that connect. So they're going to be the ones who are going to wait this one out and make sure that what they have is fine, that they don't need to buy new adapters, new dongles, new Bluetooth, and they're going to wait that out as long as they possibly can until they actually have to get that new iPhone, because no longer the apps they have no longer are supported on their old iPhone. And finally, you have the laggards. The laggards are people who may still have a flip phone, who may not even be in the smartphone generation. And they are going to be the ones who are going to hold out literally the longest until they realize that they cannot FaceTime their daughter or granddaughter on a flip phone and need to actually buy a smartphone to see that connection. So they will be literally the last ones who are going to hold out, because in their eyes, the phone has always worked as a phone. You pick it up, you dial, someone else picks up, you can text somebody. If that's all they're looking for and that's all they need, their flip phone is actually fine for that. But until they get to the point where that is so obsolete that Sprint and Verizon are actually not supporting flip phones anymore, they will be the most resistant to change. And in this whole curve, we see a lot of parallels to teachers as well, and specifically around teachers' affinity or aversion towards risk and innovation. And what we look at a lot is we highlight the early adopters, because we feel like this group of teachers have the right mindset and capacity to actually make this work of school change actually happen. They have the right affinity for risk-taking, for innovation, for failing forward, and really embody this entrepreneurial spirit, and especially this leadership quality, because these are the ones who are actually going to be trying this out in their classroom, failing forward, but not getting deterred by failures, and actually getting reignited through that and actually documenting their work. Innovators are also doing this incredible work on the left side, but they might be doing that in their classrooms and are just so quick on changing it that they're not actually documenting their process and sharing it back. So your early adopters are the ones who you're really going for. And what's great about them is that they're not deterred by a lot of this work. They're not going to get turned off by any failures. They're really excited. And one more part that I really want to talk about is this: through this entire curve, this is not reflective in the least of any teacher quality. There are great teachers across this entire curve, from innovators to laggards. This does not mean that teachers are not good, they're not able for it. There could be fantastic teachers in each one of these categories who have a really deep understanding of content, who have really good rapport with their students, who are amazing, stage on the stage, can actually transfer that content knowledge to students. So this is not reflective at all of teacher quality. It's more of just your affinity and aversion towards risk. And then and also, how much proof do you need as an educator to believe something before you're actually going to jump into it? Do you really need a lot of proof to try something out, or are you willing to just jump in? Do you need a lot of scaffolds in place to go ahead of something, or do you need to wait for that actually to come down to you so you have a lot of confidence around something before you do it? So we want to make sure that point is very clear. This is not a reflection of teacher quality. It's more of just your aversion and affinity towards risk and innovation.
So I just would add that this is probably the most important decision in our framework, is the teachers that you're selecting to lead this effort. And I can point to example after example where principals and lead change agents insisted that we work with all the 6th grade teachers, or that we worked with all the math teachers. And I'm telling you, there's very slim chance that your 13.5% early adopters all are 6th grade teachers. And so what ends up happening is we might have one early adopter teacher in that set of teachers who's really excited and comfortable taking the risks that we're asking them to take, but nobody else is. And so all of the energy coaching the rest of that cohort is about coaxing them along and trying to get them to get their feet wet, and it wastes a lot of time and momentum. So even if you might have teachers in different grade levels or in different content areas, it's so important to pick the early adopters. And I sometimes think about, it's a hard decision. You really have to think about mindset. And so sometimes I described early adopters as competitive divers, because competitive divers have to have the mindset to be on the end of a diving board and throw the hardest dive they can in front of an audience. And so they don't have much time to master one skill before they're pushing the envelope on another. And I see the early majority, late majority as swimmers who are still exceptional athletes, but they're just really working on perfecting 4 strokes. And they might spend 10 years doing that. But so like they're really focused on getting better at what's in front of them, but they're not really comfortable getting up on a board and throwing a 2.5. That's where your early adopters come in and say, I will try that and I will show you an easy way to do it. So it's just critical that you think carefully about the teachers you're putting in this position and whether they have the mindsets to really be successful there.
Absolutely. And George just asked a question, which is a great question, which is a great segue to this slide. George asked, is there any kind of formal assessment to identify early adopters? So actually I'm going to talk about that right now, George. So thank you for teeing that up for us. In this slide, you'll see what's called the iNicol Blended Teacher Competency Framework on the left side. And that was developed over several years through iNicol. And what's nice about it is it's a really straightforward, yet powerful and simple tool to identifying who are the people you're looking for and what do you need from them to qualify them as early adopters. So if you think about that, if you look at that picture right there, the outside circle are mindsets. And that kind of is like the biggest entry point and kind of the beginning part of qualifying someone as an early adopter. Do they actually envision and have this new vision for teaching and learning? And do they have an orientation and a mindset towards change and improvement? If your teachers are coming to the table and saying that, you know, this has always worked for us, our school is great, you know, I've learned this way, so why do we need to change it? That's not a new vision for teaching and learning. That's kind of going with the current model. So you really need to possess this new vision for teaching and learning and see the need for change before you can actually go into change. Next, in the next circle inside, you'll see qualities, and those qualities about grit, transparency, and collaboration are key to actually making this whole design team process move forward. You have to be able to collaborate with your peers and then bounce ideas off each other and explore different ideas together. You have to have that grit and the perseverance to get through challenges that are inadvertently going to come up over the course of the pilot and have the grit to keep going and being transparent, you know, documenting everything you're doing and being transparent about your challenges and failures that'll help the design team iterate and make this better for you. But all those qualities really encompass what an early adopter teacher needs to have in order to move forward with this process. And then within skills, you'll see on the left side, you'll see adaptive skills, which is, as a teacher, are you reflective of your own skills? Are you continuously improving your methods? And are you communicating this back and forth with the design team and other people of this pilot teacher cohort? So that part is really important, and Cathy will talk about that a little bit later as we talk about the reflection piece and the improvement piece as well. And then on the right side, which I would arguably say is probably one of the less important pieces are the technical skills. A lot of people look at technical skills as one of the main qualifying factors, but in reality, technical skills can certainly be taught over time. This idea of managing blended learning tools, managing Google Drive, having enough devices in your class and using Chromebooks, implementing new platforms, a lot of this can be taught. So it's certainly a part of this entire early adopter concentric circles, but it's really not a necessary skill and not something that you need to use right away to make sure people can be early adopters. In our eyes, the mindsets and quality is so much more important to actually being able to really have this work moving forward. The technical skills can certainly be taught as well. And
break it down to, like, if you walk into a classroom, some indicators of early adopters. One is really great classroom management. One is really great relationships. So teachers really knowing their kids and there being a lot of mutual respect between students and teachers, and then students and students. So just a really positive learning culture. I feel like early adopters are willing to open their classrooms even if they haven't perfected something. They'll say, yeah, come on in, I'm just starting something new today, let's see what happens. And they're not afraid of kind of not going perfectly in front of an audience. They're willing to try. And I think the fourth thing is that they have a really entrepreneurial attitude. It's kind of like, well, if that didn't work, let's try to figure out something that will work. So they're really adept problem solvers. And I feel like as educators, we tend to kind of throw everything out if something isn't working. Like the pendulum swings so quickly and to such an extreme. And early adopters will say, no, I really feel like we have something here. We just need to tweak it and then test it again. And they're willing to engage in that process.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that the entrepreneurial skill is the most important part. These are really your entrepreneurs of your design team, and these are the ones who are leading that change. And they're not afraid of having a mini startup going in their classroom. So those are the ones who you're really looking for, who embody those leadership and innovation skills. And also what's great about this deck is that we've actually linked to a lot of different resources right in this deck. So if you have the deck open in front of you, there are a couple more links in here. The actual graphic is a link to the whole framework and some more information around that. And then we've also linked, we have an MOU in there around recruiting pilot teachers. So thinking about how do you want to recruit them, as well as self-assessment. So George, to answer your question, when we talk about recruiting pilot teachers, there are a couple different ways, and Kathy can certainly add to this as well. We've seen it work where administrators can just kind of do a survey of who's in their district and invite the ones who they think would be a really good fit for this. As well as you could also do an all call where it's open to anybody and people could actually apply for this opportunity to be part of the early adopters. But this really comes down to your culture, and if it really depends on your culture and whether your school has a culture of being able for people to be able to apply for this, whether you think it's better to kind of select them. We see some schools that kind of fall into this tying of early adopters to incentives. So we worked with a school that would give out a class set of Chromebooks to early adopters, or would buy a free ticket to a conference for next year if you're part of this early adopters. And while that is helpful and it's good to reward for them for their time, because they're going to be in the trenches for quite a while with this hard work, it could also bring a lot of the wrong people to the table. So it's really important to think about who you're actually selecting and not just taking everyone who raises their hand or is really interested in this work. So we really would focus on doing, like Kathy mentioned, those classroom walkthroughs, going into the classrooms, seeing what's going on in the classrooms, and being able to kind of figure out who has the right mindset for this work. That could be done through one-on-one conversations. I think it's really going through that. You could certainly use these resources here as a self-assessment, but I think it really depends on your culture and what you think is the best way to bring these teachers together and pick the right ones.
So I think it's great to be really transparent about the challenges of this work, so that people aren't expecting a ton of guidance and a lot of step-by-step instruction. It's really defining a vision and letting them operationalize it. And so people need to be comfortable with that straight up. And the other point I wanted to make is that in some cases, it's been a hard argument for us to make to have coaches work with early adopters. So often when we go into schools, leaders want us to work with teachers who are struggling because they feel like there's an urgency there and a need to help these teachers become more proficient in the classroom. But that really is not where we feel like our resources are best invested. That if you have teachers who have an appetite for change, you're going to be able to push them a lot harder and learn a lot more about what works in your school than if you're working with teachers who you feel like have an urgency to change, but they don't have an appetite for change. So I think sometimes it's important to communicate that as well, like why you're investing your resources this way, and what you're hoping to gain is a model that can then translate through the faculty, be faculty developed, and have a lot of credibility and on-site support for kind of spreading it to other classrooms.
Right, like they say, invest in your best, because those are the ones who are really going to lower those barriers to entry for everyone else. So investing in your best, which, as Kathy mentioned, could be a big mindset shift for most, because you typically want to invest your coaching into your struggling teachers. But like Kathy saw, that there's a longer arc of change, and eventually those people will have coaching as well. But investing in your best is a great way to start as well.
And it's super memorable. The rhyme is memorable.
So when you think of pilot teachers, we use this metaphor of these pilot teachers kind of being these like fragile eggs in a nest, and we have to build this nest around them to protect them, because these are the ones who are really the R&D engine, and they need a lot of support around them to make sure that this R&D engine can carry forward throughout the year. So there's a couple different things, and we got to think about, what do these teachers really need, as opposed to these these fancy incentives of giving them Chromebooks or conferences. What do they actually need? And they do need a lot of different supports. So one example is collaboration time, the time to plan, discuss, explore with their other peers who are in it. And this is where, as Kathy mentioned, it could get really tempting to just sign up the entire 6th grade team to be your early adopters, because they already have that planning, that they have that CPT time, they already have that. But we really encourage you not to get pulled into that, because that is not usually, you're not going to have all your early adopters in one grade level team or one content area. although it is tempting, you have to build in collaboration time across the district and across different times and different grade levels to actually have that time to come together. Giving them the autonomy as well. I think this really requires a reflection of policies in place at the school and thinking about what autonomy can you give pilot teachers to make their own decisions around this work as well. Barrier reduction, thinking about what are the barriers that are going to come up and how can the design team work to support them and reduce barriers for the teachers. And this may be a short-term solution, but as long as we're thinking about how do we least impede the progress of our early adopter teachers. Giving them resource and tools and hopefully giving them access to all the tools and strategies and methods that they need to actually implement this work. Coaching, as Cathy mentioned, really important and probably one of the most expensive pieces of supporting pilot teachers and creating this pilot nest. It is pricey and it's typically invested in your struggling teachers, but if we think about how can we maximize the potential of our best teachers, that will have a lot more, that'll pay a lot more dividends over the course of your entire Pathways Personalization framework, because over that longer arc of change, everyone will get the effects of it, but your best are the ones who are actually diffusing that work throughout the curve. And then regular meetings, having time for them to check in with each other, having time for them to bring their concerns to the design team meeting, air out any frustrations, but having that time built in for them to check in and be able to collaborate more often over the course of the design team process.
So this is a great list, and I feel like coaching is probably the most important support. But I also wanted to take a second to talk a little bit more about the autonomy and barrier reduction, because certainly what happens when we have pilot efforts that have selected really aspirational models and really want to push the envelope on 21st century skills and collaboration and project-based learning, but they're also faced with a strict pacing curriculum guide. They're in tension with each other. And so you're not going to get much out of your pilot teachers if they need to follow a pacing guide that forces them to be on page 50 by Friday, because they're not going to have any time to explore those practices or to engage their students in different ways. They're just going to have to deliver that content like they usually do. And so what we suggest to design teams and district leaders and lead change agents is to think about policy waivers for pilot teachers with accountability. So you're not just going to strike down all of the pacing guides, but you're going to relax them so that pilot teachers, and these are your best teachers, these are your divers, these are the teachers who can handle all of these different variables and juggle them. They're going to have the autonomy to make the best decisions and to push on what they think is most important. And then we're going to look at data and see what the impact is on those students. And so as those barriers arise, we think about reducing them for pilot cohorts within the back of our mind, knowing that once we try to scale this, we're going to have to really rethink policies and systems to make this work easier for the colleagues in the other categories. So it's your research and development part. It's really thinking about what kind of autonomy can you give pilot teachers to really learn what you want to learn.
So Cathy, Melissa asked a good question. She asked, have you ever had issues with turning away early adopters or pilot teachers who want to participate, but they weren't ready? Maybe their mindset was off. How do you do that without hindering their interest in implementing these changes later on?
So I think that's a great question. And we do that in different ways depending on the schools that we're in. So if we have a lot of teachers who are excited about this work, we have a lot of parallel opportunities for people to get involved. So we say, look, this opportunity, we're really going to start with 5, but we're going to actually have you guys be part of the walkthroughs in the classroom. We're going to have you be part of trying new strategies alongside them, because if they're people who are willing, then let's invite them in and find a way that we can best support them. So you might have professional learning communities that live kind of supplementary to the design team effort. You might have a really large cohort of pilot teachers, depending on the coaching resources that you have. But if you know that their mindset is not quite there, then I would put them on kind of a track just under pilot teachers, where they're getting all the information, they're included in the meetings if they want to be, but we're not counting on them to push the envelope. So they're kind of, they can go in and observe the teachers and they can try it in their own classrooms. And then we learn from both, but we're really focused on what we can learn from pilot classrooms. And I'm trying to think of other kind of supplementary opportunities. We ran happy hours. We had mentor teachers in one school who kind of opened their classrooms all the time for people to come in and out, and then had time to prep after school to plan. We had pilot teachers lead staff meetings where they would share really great strategies that they were using that were attached to the vision, and share all of those resources with their colleagues so they could also implement. So what we found is, as long as you're really transparent about the limited amount of pilot teachers that you can take and the resources you have to support them, you also embrace opportunities for anyone to get involved who wants to. You'll have a lot more momentum once you've identified your right practices and model for that to scale. And it can start whenever teachers are ready.
I've seen a couple of districts, like Kathy mentioned, the parallel opportunities. One district we work with actually ran on conferences every Saturday and had these Saturday events that they had the pilot teachers, but also anyone in the district who wanted to present at. And an unconference is basically anyone can come and present on anything, and people kind of vote the day of. So those are really successful, as well we saw in this building. Another district we work with did an annual PL showcase, a personalized learning showcase, and then everyone would come and present there as well. But that was really heavily involved from every teacher in the district, not just those early adopters. And then we've seen a lot of schools run Twitter chats as well. Twitter chats are a great way to get your whole community involved, get your district involved around certain topics in education, so anyone can be part of that. So these are kind of smaller, lighter touch ways to get these people who are really interested involved. That may be not quite there yet, but different ways can develop their interest and their passion around this work.
There's sometimes too when you have more early adopters than you can support, when time becomes a variable that can differentiate the pilot teachers you take in the first cohort, because it is an incredible amount of time. You're redesigning a lot of your lessons. You're spending a lot of time thinking about how to integrate choice and what those choices look like, different playlists for different kids, differentiated instruction. It's a lot. It's a lot, and almost every early adopter pilot teacher that I've worked with has invested considerable time in this effort, especially initially. So if you have early adopters that are new parents, or they have other stuff going on in their lives, that this would really kind of tip the balance in an unhealthy way. So that could be a differentiator as well. If someone doesn't quite have the time yet, but can get involved in a lesser kind of less intensive way, it might work out better.
And Kathy, George asked a follow-up question that, is there a risk of creating a sense of segregation between pilot teachers versus non-pilot teachers? And if so, how would you deal with that?
I think the best examples of handling that have been principal transparency, saying, look, we're really interested in this, but we're not sure what direction we want to take, and we're not going to make everyone do the same thing like we have in the past. We're going to really take some time to get teachers to think about what works best. So we're looking for teachers who have the time, who have kind of the capacity to really be on the front lines of this work. And we want to see how many people are interested in that. And here's what it's going to entail. And here is the support that you're going to receive. And then you kind of get a first sense of the group, knowing that ultimately that support and guidance will be available for every teacher. But we're just kind of slowing down the process so we can learn. And then most of the time, I can't think of one time where we've had so many people volunteer that we've had to really rethink the whole kind of culture of a pilot. It's possible that you could just start implementing with more than a pilot group. Really, I mean, you can do whatever works in your context. But I've never really had critical mass raise their hands to be pilot teachers. We've had situations where maybe there have been 2 or 3 teachers who are thinking about it, but we didn't ask. But I think if you explain the demands and the expectations of that work, you really do kind of self-select out some of the people who might not be ready for it.
Great. Thank you for the questions, guys. Keep them coming. We'll keep moving on, though.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about structuring the learning process once you've identified your pilot teachers. So this is another kind of key part of our R&D engine. So from last webinar, we talked about leveraging our priority practices tool, which is linked in that second block above, to think about the practices that really resonate with you and your team, what you want to see more of in classrooms. And so once you've identified that set of priority practices, we usually say 3 to 5. Then we take some time with the pilot teachers to brainstorm instructional strategies. So if you want to see more choice in classrooms, what kind of strategies will help support that? So what is a choice board and how might we implement that? And what resources do we need? And what materials do we need? And what are the different ways we can attack choice in our routines that make it really relevant and compelling for the subject and grade level we're teaching? So then we determine those entry points and we create a game plan for starting. So coaches will meet with the pilot teachers. They'll talk about what they're going to start doing. They'll get them up and running, support. They'll co-plan, maybe co-teach and debrief. And more often than not, if you have a true early adopter, you start moving quickly. Like, oh, choice is great, but now I feel like I need to differentiate that choice. And these things kind of build on each other. So from there, we talk about, oh, this was just from a reminder of last time. So once you are ready for the pilot work, you have a vision statement, you have a set of priority practices, and you have a set of strategies where you've kind of brainstormed what some starting points might be for each practice. So teachers have a decent sense of how they're going to kind of begin to start this work. So then we really think about data collection. And we are continuously learning about this process and how to make it sustainable for teachers and schools. But we're trying to collect 3 types of data from our pilot effort. The first is a process measure. And a process measure answers the question, is instruction changing? And so 3 times a year, we go into pilot classrooms for walkthroughs with our priority practices rubric. And on a 4-point scale, we look for evidence of each practice with a focus on the practices that were selected by the design team. We want to understand if choice is a priority, do we actually see choice happening in the classroom? The second is an outcome measure. And typically that answers the question, if practice is changing, are outcomes subsequently changing? So this is a tough one for me because we've kind of reverted back to student interim assessments and student state testing results as our main outcome measures, because you have to have achievement measures. But if you're really excited about student engagement and student choice, I'm not sure that a STAR test is really going to get at whether that practice has made an impact. And so we're trying to right now, as we speak, diversify the outcome measures that we use to try to have a validated measure that on student engagement, or measure hope, or measure happiness, or measure socio-emotional criteria, but really kind of thinking, we'll measure achievement, but how else, what other outcomes are important to us, and how can we collect data on that? So even if our work isn't necessarily having huge impacts on achievement, we really care about engagement and attendance, and that's what we want to measure, and that's kind of our starting point. So that is our outcome measure, could be more than one. And then our final one is our balance measure, and this answers the question, do pilot teachers and students actually like the changes that are happening? So there are cases where we've changed instruction and data has incrementally grown, but the students have hated it, hated it. One of the examples was struggling students spend more time with the teacher. So in the elementary grades, the kids love spending more time with the teacher. They're super excited. They get, they feel like they have, special relationships with their first, second, third grade teacher. But as kids get older, the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th graders hated having to spend more time with the teacher when they were struggling, while their peers were doing much more interesting project work or group work. So having that balance measure really helped us iterate in a way where we could create minimum benchmarks for students to leave that group and then start working on the more interesting work. And they weren't just kind of stuck there forever. So this is all part of the kind of data story we try to get from each pilot classroom, and then as a pilot cohort to see how things are going, to see if our practices are on point, to see what is actually improving student outcomes and in what ways, and then how people are feeling about that. So I've kind of collected a snapshot of what each of these might look like. So here are the priority practices that were in our vision statement a few slides back, and how we measured them from the beginning of the year to the middle of the year. So there was increases, there were some huge increases, there was decreases. In our outcome measure, which was STAR tests, we had modest scores growing in math and modest achievement gaps closing in math, but in ELA we had the opposite, which brings up a lot of questions. And then in the balance measures, when we talked to parents and students, we had a lot of different kind of comments that made us refocus our work at those midpoint meetings. So periodically, at least once in the middle of the year and at the end of the year, we gather the design team and pilot teachers together to really dive into this data, and that's where Shawn is today. So thinking about what are the gains and what do you think are the cause of the gains, and if there's any decreases in the data, what do we think are causing those? And so we iterate on strategies, we iterate on practices, and we kind of figure out what our next steps are going to be. So in this particular case, the work started in math. And so it made sense when we kind of peeled back the onion that because we instituted a station approach in math and integrated some of these practices into that approach, the students were talking about math more, and there was a modest increase in math. Beginning of year to middle of the year is not gonna, it's not a long enough arc of change to really say, yes, this is good. It gives us a little bit of information to move forward with. So the process of this continuous improvement is really, it's central to collect these data strands and continuously monitor where you are, where you intend to be, and then to make those iterations and changes if you need to. You want to add anything, Rose?
We actually have a couple of questions coming in that I wanted to toss your way. So Teresa had a good question. She's like, of these three measures that we have, do we value one over the other between the process, outcome, and balance measures?
I think they're all complementary. So if we just look at outcome measures, but we don't look at process, we're not sure if the outcome measure is due to any changes that happened or if it's just the students themselves. So I think if you see changes in classroom instruction and the process measure, it gives you're like, okay, something's changed. Now we can say, is that change good or bad? And the outcome measure and the balance measure will help answer that question. So they really kind of are used together to tell a story. So I think, yeah, I don't need to say any more words about that.
And I think that we hear this a lot too. How do you sell this to parents, or I guess even educators who are so invested in the academic outcomes and in those parts and don't look enough at the other pieces, the balance measures and the process measures? How do you sell it to people who are really focused on those academic outcomes only?
So I think you always make academic outcomes part of your plan, and you talk about what additional outcomes are important to you. And I think you're just really honest that if you have strong academic outcomes and they're flatlined, then maybe what you really care about is engagement, choice, agency, things like that. But it depends on your school district. You definitely need to have those conversations with parents to talk about what you value and to see what they value and to understand how you can measure both things or all things, but not put undue emphasis on academics unless the data suggests that you're really not, like you're really harming kids academically through this work. And so for me, academic benchmarks are an important like thermometer, like a benchmark to make sure that you're really you're moving forward, and these alternate ways of teaching and instruction and pacing are still going to leave students academically prepared. I mean, I think the problem is, I think in the field, they're struggling with identifying another academic outcome that talks about creativity and collaboration and problem solving, and it's not as tied to the math and ELA standards. And until we have that, we're kind of left on our own to decide whether we think those things are valuable or not. So you always kind of have to do it all, unfortunately, at this point.
And I think, like, to your point, Cathy, this really helps kind of tell a more complete story than just looking at one of those measures by itself. And as we can see here, it's not always really even clean and clear cut as to how something is growing. If you look at the data, it can be really messy sometimes. Sometimes you'll see improvements or reductions in the outcome measured, but unless you get that qualitative side, that balance measure, and the actual process of how things have been growing based on what you're actually measuring, it's really hard to figure out where you're really at. So I think having all three of these tell just a more encompassing and wholesome story around it. And you really need all these pieces in place to really tell a better story and to really kind of figure out where you're going, because one of these is not going to be able to tell you a complete picture of what's going on in that classroom.
And I do think that the achievement data is, I have different weights of importance on it depending on what grade the students are. I think for kindergarten and first grade, I pay a little closer attention to STAR data in ELA for those early literacy indicators. And if they are much lower in these pilot classrooms, I'm trying to figure out why, and we're trying to iterate and not throw the baby out with the bathwater, but really be intentional about figuring out a way to make sure that those early literacy skills are being captured in the stations or the choice or the whatever it is that they're focusing on. I think as kids get older in fourth and fifth grade, measures of fluency might not necessarily be an adequate measure of the competencies that students are building in 21st century classrooms. So I'm a little bit less inclined to have like dramatic iterations if there's a tiny decrease compared to control. You just kind of have to move through it, especially if teachers like, I know this is making a difference. My kids are happier. They're doing much more rigorous thinking. So that's why these meetings are really important to decide kind of how do you know that this is actually something that's valuable.
Great. And thank you, Therese and Stephanie, for the comments. Therese said, I agree. We need parents to see that there is a value to balancing all of this. And Stephanie also commented that she, on your previous slide about deciding on strategies for each practice is very helpful because it makes those practices much more concrete for every teacher to understand. So thank you for the comments and keep the questions coming. We'll keep going. We have about 5 or 10 more minutes of content, and then we're gonna do some small group breakout.
I think Roshni just said this, that it's messy. And so sometimes when I'm looking for early adopter pilot teachers, I show them this slide and I say, what is your comfort level with what success really looks like? Are you okay with having a squiggly line being your process through this? Because some people will tell you, no, I'm not okay with that. I really need a straight line through this work. And so what this pilot process is aiming to do is build a straight line for the rest of your colleagues, but your process is going to be squiggly. Okay, documenting learning.
And Kim just asked, do you track digital content usage? I'm assuming she means that as part of one of our measures.
I think we do if it's valuable to the design team to do that. So we don't mandate specifically what is tracked, but if that is important then to the team, then we do.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for the questions, guys. Okay, so moving on to the next part about the documentation of our learning. So back to the early adoption curve that we have here, and we talked about the early adopters. One big thing that we've noticed over the course of our pilots, and as well as it's been documented quite well, Jeffrey Moore came out with this, I think, in the early 90s around between the early adopters and the early majority, there's a gap there, and that's a pretty sizable gap, and it's commonly referred to as the chasm. And the chasm basically showed that it is really difficult to get from the early adopters to your early majorities, because you are now jumping from the visionaries of the world to the realists of the world. And these are your visionaries who can see everything and keep going with it. And now you have your realists on the other side of the chasm who are really waiting to figure out, is this going to stick? Is this actually going to work for us? And I need a lot of support and proof to make sure this works. So the idea is that we have to be able to cross this chasm and actually make this work. Because if you have a school change initiative that falls in that chasm and never moves on, it could be stuck there. And we see this happen in a lot of schools where they, if you think about a lot of schools, and I'm sure you guys know a lot of different buildings where you can walk in and even though we're about 10 years into blended learning, a lot of schools say that they have pockets. They still have these little pockets operating in different schools, but it's not a full-fledged a scaled model yet. So how do you really scale it? And as soon as you can jump that chasm and go to that early majority, you now have critical mass. You now have created a bandwagon effect that will continue on to everything else, but that will now become the de facto standard if you can cross that chasm and make this a standard and have your critical mass on board. So the book, the core of the book really talks about not only how do you implement this, but how do you scale it? And scaling it literally begins with that little tiny rickety bridge right there. how do you jump that chasm? You create this really small bridge, and Cathy's going to talk about what those strategies are in the next slide. But thinking about that, we start small and we have these really intentional practices to actually build that little bridge to hopefully cross that chasm and don't leave your reform initiative stuck in that big gap right there.
Yeah, so this is the million-dollar question. How do you cross the chasm? How do you move these practices beyond classrooms of early adopters? And initially, we thought it would be so easy. It would be like replicating a Taco Bell. Like once you build the Taco Bell, you have everyone come and see it, and then they go build Taco Bells too. But it isn't like that at all, because those other teachers don't have the same capacity or mindset as the early adopters, and it's too hard. The degree of difficulty is too hard. And so through lots of lessons learned over the past 5 years, we've realized that crossing the chasm is essentially a human endeavor that requires relationships. Relationships are at the center of any strategy to get people to cross this chasm and try new things in their classrooms. And that different people require different information in order to feel comfortable. But if they have someone that they respect who is helping them or guiding them or supporting them, they're much more likely to cross that bridge. And the three kind of main categories, the main types of information that we feel like folks on the other side of the chasm are looking for, one is a data story. So early majority teachers just want to understand that what you're selling is going to be a value add in their classroom. So all of that data that you collected during the pilot phase and all of those graphs and balance measures and data outcomes, those will be a really strong selling point. And in the schools that we're in right now, as soon as we see strong data, we have people who are like, I want to try. I went in there and I'm seeing the outcomes and I'm seeing the value. I want to get involved. And so for some people, that's all they need. Some people need a little bit more, especially the folks in the late majority category. You really do need to lower the degree of difficulty of this work for them. And so we've created this concept of an implementation pathway. So when you are learning in pilot classrooms, you are documenting every strategy connected to every practice that is going well, that is finding traction. So if you have a collaboration station where kids have roles and expectations and they're attacking really rigorous problems and it's going well and they have a lot of agency, we're documenting it, we're taking video of it, we're having people come in and see it, and we're really giving them a blueprint for how they can take it and adapt it in their classroom. We're not just saying, see it, go ahead. We're giving them a lot more scripted guidance. And then some folks are going to say, yeah, it's great, but there's this barrier and this barrier and this barrier, and it's never going to work. And for those people, we really need to review our policies and systems so that once we get to that point, they can rely on us to have some reductions in place so that we have the ability to take those barriers away. So maybe it's scheduling, or maybe it's curriculum policy, or maybe it's resources, or maybe it's culture and climate, whatever it is that they can point to and say, this is the reason why I can't do this. We try to reduce those barriers. So those are our three main strategies for crossing the chasm. And we're actually going to talk about them in more depth in the third webinar, but we just wanted to, as part of the refine phase, is getting all these ducks in a row. So you have answers to these questions that when people kind of are wondering how this is all going to play out, you're saying, we've got you, because here's what we have in store, and here's how we're planning to make this as easy for you as possible. So let's see, what time is it? Do you want to stop now, Rosh, and like we can talk about mapping barriers in the next one.
I think that makes sense. Why don't we give them a good half hour to get in small groups so we can make sure we put this slide into the next webinar in June.
So we've talked about a ton of stuff. And so I want you to be able to talk to you if you've taken any notes, things that are compelling, things that you want to push back on. That's something that you can do in your small group. We have, again, a note doc, which would be a great place for you to put ideas, resources, lessons, activities, like data instruments, anything that you feel like you've experienced that would help other people in this work. And we're going to have one person who's going to share out key points when we get back. Roshi's going to mastermind that while you guys are doing your small groups. So your task, your discussion question, in addition to anything that you guys would like to talk about, is thinking about the activities, messaging, or opportunities that help engage teachers, get teachers excited about this work. Any data processes, protocols, instruments that you've used that you want to share, and just barriers that you've addressed, barriers that still exist, kind of how you're thinking about that.
All right, so in a minute, you guys will get a invitation to a breakout room, so you guys can join that. The only caveat is that if you're on a phone, I think one of you are on the phone, it won't work well from a phone, so you'll have to use an actual device, which I believe most of you are on. When you get the invite, please hit accept. It'll take you from this room to that small room. In that small room, please turn your audio and video back on.
Oh, we lost you, Roshni. No. I lost you mid-sentence.
I'll send out the breakout room.
Oh, there it is. You're back.
Okay. So again, once you guys get into your breakout room, just make sure you turn your audio and video back on, please, so you guys can talk through that, and then we'll bring you guys back in about, let's say, 15 to 20 minutes.
Great. So please introduce yourselves to your group mates, and then have a great discussion.
All right, we'll see you guys back here in about 15 minutes. All right, I think we got you guys all back. I believe everyone is back in here.
Hopefully you had great discussions. It looks like from your notes that you did.
Yeah, this looks great. Thank you guys, everyone, for participating in the discussion, everyone turning your cameras back on and talking. We jumped into each one, and they sound like they're really rich, solid discussions. So you guys can keep your camera on for right now. Just go on mute. And we're going to ask one person from each group to give like a 1 to 2 minute recap of what they talked about. So for breakout room 1, Kim, Audra, or George, would you guys be willing to share? You guys can go ahead and unmute yourselves and share what you guys talked about in your group.
Hi, this is Audra. So in our group, we really talked about how under what's working is really kind of connecting with the purpose of why we started teaching. So using that as within our coaching of helping teachers and administrators and coaches connect with wanting to make that impact, and then seeing students grow and developing those relationships with them are some of those markers that are really the motivation to keep going. And really focusing on common language so that we understand what we're talking about and what our goal set is. And for us in Clark County, that's our CIA method, which I referenced on our sheet. And then as far as looking at what instruments and processes we have in place. So again, we have that CIA process, which we're really using to try to kind of help as a district us adopt this new pedagogical practice of blended learning, so we're all kind of on the same page. And then George was sharing with us that in Brazil, they're really focusing on not only understanding that there are differences with our students, but also teaching. The teacher themselves is different. So they've been using the Myers-Briggs assessment to kind of understand where they fit in that, and then bringing that cultural diversity to their classroom. And having that walkthrough tool to kind of understand what we should be looking for. We use that here in Clark County. And then some barriers that we have, we all kind of agreed, like a lack of knowledge and understanding on what blended and personalized learning is. So again, trying to make sure we all are using that common vocabulary. Oftentimes they will purchase the devices without kind of having the vision. That's a big barrier for us here in Clark County. And just helping them understand the difference between personalizing and blending instruction versus just implementing technology, and that there really is a difference between those two things. So it's kind of a synopsis of our talk.
Awesome. And what was the link that you included?
Oh, so this is our blended initiative that our department has started, and this has a lot of resources that we've put together as a department to kind of support our teachers, coaches, and administrators as they go through this process. So our walkthrough tools on there, we've developed templates for blended learning lesson plans on there. We've got all of our CIA branding and walking them through what the components of that are, just to really support our teachers as they go through this process. So there's this a repository of resources. So that's what that is.
Thank you for sharing that. It sounds amazing.
All right, let's jump over to breakout room number 2. So we had Melissa, Stephanie, and a gentleman who says 11. I think he's probably something. So 11, Stephanie or Melissa, who would like to share out?
Hi, it's Melissa here. So we talked about a couple different things. We were an elementary, middle, and high school teachers, so we got like a nice perspective throughout our group conversation. And we said what helped most with the buy-in, we found that walkthroughs were really great to get people in the classroom, seeing what's going on. Small cohorts of teachers who were focused on these topics, who got to talk about these topics and meet semi-regularly and dive into a lot of these and spread awareness and excitement around their district or schools. We said that some of the valuable things we've seen working, everyone kind of agreed walkthroughs were great, and just getting people in to see the process from start to finish, not just seeing a finished classroom who's got the system working perfectly, but reminding people that it's going to be messy and it's going to be changing, and that's okay, and showing them, you know, the people who even technically know what they're doing or were identified as knowing what they're doing don't really know what they're doing, and that's okay. And we talked about the pineapple model, where you put like a little pineapple on your door, and that means your room is open for observation that day, just to get colleagues helping each other with the walkthroughs versus administration only giving feedback on walkthroughs. And that was kind of like setting up a base for peer coaching in some of the districts we talked about. And then some of our barriers have been changing administration. And having new administrators come in and bringing them up to speed, taking the time to do that, or maybe not having them as on board as a previous administrator was. Time to talk with colleagues has been an essential piece, but also a barrier for a lot of us. A lot of us don't have that common planning time where we can talk out and share ideas. We said training was essential, and that's something that really helped a lot of people get comfortable. We were mostly Google Classroom schools, so kind of getting comfortable on those platforms. We said a barrier could be the grouping of your students, different ability levels and things like that, that sometimes make your pacing difficult if that's one of your practices you're focusing on. And then we said that something we liked was that a lot of goal setting and time setting for this has been something successful. So kind of not giving students a step-by-step timeline, but just saying, here's your end date, and letting them work from there has been really great.
Those are great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Melissa. Last, can we have someone share out from either Therese, Kristen, or Vicky? You guys seem to have a lot in here, so I can imagine it's hard to share it all out, but if you can give us a quick synopsis.
Sorry, I thought I unmuted myself. This is Vicky. It's Therese. So I was taking the notes on most of this in my district. We're just kind of in the beginning phases, but one of the things that we talked about was, I guess if I start from the left, is that engaging teachers in the work, because she is the only second grade teacher that is doing this, but that getting like good feedback from parents on what she's doing and things like that is helping. Also just seeing the excitement of the kids wanting to come in and do the work has been helpful with the buy-in. Data instruments or processes that have been valuable are exit tickets to help determining student groups, and then also discussion about a next step being a student rubric. So, you know, students could say, you know, how do I judge myself as a learner? Am I collaborative with others? And am I academically prepared as a learner? And then barriers being, as an early adopter, feeling lonely and getting pushback from other people saying, why do we have to do things differently if things are already working a certain way? And then personally, she had shared that one of her barriers is coming up with enough activities. Like right now, she's able to differentiate in terms of what she's doing with the kids in her small group and with the technology, but the rotations themselves don't have that differentiation.
Great. Reminds me that the thread through that reminds me of there's a cohort of 3 pilot teachers at one of our schools who have finished their first year of piloting, and all 3 of them are so excited to teach again. Like they just are so enthusiastic. Their students are so enthusiastic, and that alone has gotten other teachers interested because they've noticed such a shift in their kind of morale and just excitement to get back in the classroom and try something. So it really has been that good feedback from students and just feeling like you're kind of becoming more effective in the classroom again, even after a decade or two of teaching. So that has been really inspiring. I feel like these barriers are so real. And we're going to talk more about barriers next time in the session 3 when we talk about scaling, like where we get nitty gritty about kind of the human piece of scale and some strategies for that. I think we're about out of time. Are there any final questions?
We have a couple announcements, so I know we're right at time. Kathy, if you want to go back to that last slide.
Yes.
So a couple quick announcements from our end. On that last slide in there, if you don't mind taking a minute to give us some feedback, we really value that, and we've actually built these webinars based off your feedback. So if you don't mind giving that to us, we really appreciate it. There's a link built in right over there. We have our next webinar coming up on Thursday, June 6th at 4:30 to 6 as well. That's going to be chapters 9 through 12. We have a couple more spots in the webinar, so if you want to encourage a friend or colleague to join, please let us know. We're happy to add them into the invites as well. We'll be sending out a recording of this webinar in the next couple of days, so look out for that. If a colleague or friend missed it, let us know. And lastly, we got a couple questions come up around just logistics and next steps. So if anyone wants to buy more books for their district or colleagues, please let us know. Reach out to us. Our emails are in here as well, and I'll drop it into the chat window. We're happy to give you guys more books and ship them over to you if you'd like. We have bulk discounts for 10 books or more. So let us know if you'd like some more books. We're also having a leadership training workshop this summer on July 30th and 31st. It's going to be for anyone who is interested in being a lead change agent. It'll be in Providence, Rhode Island at our offices from July 30th through 31st, 2 full-day sessions. So we will send that out in the follow-up email as well. If you'd like to join us for that, that'd be a great way to get the training, hands-on training with our 2 authors as well as some other colleagues that we have here, and meet some other lead change agents across the country who will be joining us. And finally, someone asked about starting their own book club in their own district. So if you say have 10 or 15 colleagues who want to do this in your own particular district and you want to start a book club with them, let us know. We'll send you some more books and we can give you a process for actually running a book club, a mini one in your own district. We have a couple of districts who have requested that from us in the past. So let us know. I'll include all of this in the follow-up email going out in the next few days. But we look forward to seeing you on Thursday, June 6th. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. We will see you guys all soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.